They huddled in the darkness, 47 Japanese women in torn uniforms, listening to American boots approaching their locked barracks. They had been told what would happen. The propaganda had been clear. American soldiers were animals who showed no mercy to women. So they clutched makeshift weapons, broken chair legs, sharpened spoons, and prepared for the worst. But when the door opened on that cold October night in 1945, the Americans carried something the women never expected. Not rifles, not chains, blankets, and steaming cups of tea. If this story moves you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. These forgotten moments of history deserve to be remembered. The island of Saipan had fallen silent after months of brutal fighting. Smoke still rose from destroyed bunkers, and the sweet, sick smell of death hung in the tropical air. Among the wreckage, American forces discovered something unexpected. A group of Japanese women, military auxiliaries who had been stationed on the island as nurses, radio operators, and administrative staff. There were 47 of them, ranging from barely 19 to their early 30s. Their crisp military uniforms had become rags. Their faces were hollow from weeks of hiding in caves, surviving on whatever they could find. Some had injuries, burns, cuts, infected wounds that had gone untreated. All of them wore the same expression, the blank stare of people who had accepted death. The Americans found them in a collapsed hospital building, where they had barricaded themselves in a basement room. When the Marines finally broke through the debris, the women screamed. Some tried to run, others simply froze, their eyes wide with terror. One older woman, Keiko, who had been a head nurse, stepped forward with her hands raised, speaking rapid Japanese that none of the Marines understood. The November heat pressed down like a weight, even as evening approached. The air tasted of ash and salt water. Around them, the island groaned with the sounds of American occupation, trucks grinding through mud, generators humming, distant voices shouting in English. To the Japanese women, every sound was a threat. They were loaded onto military trucks, cramped together in the back, gripping the sides as the vehicles bounced over cratered roads. Through the canvas covering, they caught glimpses of the devastation. Palm trees stripped to splinters, entire villages reduced to ash, Japanese bodies still lying where they had fallen. One young woman, Yuki, turned her face away and vomited over the side of the truck. The truck ride lasted 20 minutes but felt like hours. Finally, they lurched to a stop. The canvas was pulled back and bright work lights flooded in, making them squint. American soldiers stood everywhere, watching them with expressions the women could not read. Curiosity? Disgust? Pity? They were ordered out of the trucks. Most climbed down slowly, their legs shaking from exhaustion and fear. 2 had to be carried, too weak to walk. The Americans guided them toward a long wooden building surrounded by barbed wire. A prisoner of war camp. The women looked at each other, their faces showing the same thought. This is where it ends. Years of propaganda had filled their minds with stories. American soldiers were savages who tortured prisoners. American soldiers showed no honor, no respect for women. American soldiers would do unspeakable things. The women had heard these warnings from officers, from radio broadcasts, from government newspapers. Every Japanese citizen knew what capture meant. As they were lined up outside the barracks, Keiko whispered to the women near her in Japanese, "Stay together. Be strong. Remember, you are daughters of Japan." Some of the younger women began to cry quietly. Others simply stared straight ahead, their jaws clenched, trying to show the dignity they had been taught since childhood. An American officer approached with a translator, a Japanese-American soldier who looked uncomfortable in his role. The officer said something and the translator spoke. "You will be processed. You will be given medical attention. You will be housed here." The words were simple, businesslike, empty of threat. But the women did not believe them. Words were easy. Actions would tell the truth. Wait. They had expected immediate violence, immediate degradation. Instead, they were being spoken to calmly, directed with gestures rather than pushed with rifle butts. The cognitive dissonance was almost as frightening as outright brutality would have been. What were the Americans waiting for? They were taken into the building one at a time, and the waiting was torture. Each woman who disappeared through the door might never come back. Those who remained outside whispered prayers, gripped each other's hands, and tried not to imagine what was happening inside. When Yuki's turn came, she felt her legs nearly give out. She was 22 years old, had worked as a radio operator, and now walked toward what she believed would be her assault or execution. 2 female American nurses met her inside. Female nurses. Yuki stopped, confused. The nurses smiled gently and gestured for her to sit. Through the translator, they explained they needed to examine her for injuries and illness. The exam was clinical, professional, gentle. They cleaned the cut on her arm that had become infected. They checked her eyes, her throat, her lungs. When they found she was severely malnourished, one nurse made notes on a clipboard while the other squeezed Yuki's shoulder sympathetically. No one hit her. No one touched her inappropriately. No one even raised their voice. When it was over, they handed her a cup of water and told her to drink slowly. Yuki drank, her hands shaking so badly that water spilled down her chin. She kept waiting for the trap to spring, for the kindness to reveal itself as mockery. It never came. One by one, the women went through the same process. Each emerged looking dazed, confused, almost disappointed in a strange way. Their expectations of horror had been denied, leaving them floating in uncertainty. Keiko, the oldest at 34, came out last. She had expected the worst for herself, had steeled herself to endure it with dignity. Instead, the American doctor had treated her knee injury, which had been causing her pain for weeks, with the care of a professional. After the medical examinations, they were directed to another room. Inside stood several large metal tubs filled with water. Steam rose from them. The women stared. Hot water. For bathing. They looked at each other, then at the American nurses supervising, searching for the humiliation they expected. The nurses simply handed them soap and towels and told them, through the translator, to wash. The soap was white, industrial, nothing like the delicate soaps from home. But it was real soap, and it smelled clean. Yuki picked up a bar and turned it over in her hands, feeling its weight. She had not been truly clean in over a month. None of them had. They had lived in caves, in bunkers, in the ruins of buildings, with no running water, no way to wash properly. They undressed awkwardly, trying to maintain modesty even in their state. The hot water was almost painful at first, scalding against skin that had become sensitive. But as they sank into it, as the heat worked into their muscles, some of the women began to weep. Not from fear, from relief so intense it hurt. After bathing, they were given simple cotton garments to wear. Not uniforms, not prison clothes, just plain shirts and pants, clean and whole. Then they were led to a mess hall. The smell hit them before they entered. Rice. Real rice. Not the mixture of barley and weeds they had been eating toward the end, when supplies had stopped coming. Real white rice. The mess hall was a large tent with wooden tables and benches. American soldiers ate on one side, and a section had been cleared for the Japanese women. The women sat slowly, uncertain, watching the Americans for any sign of mockery or trap. The soldiers mostly ignored them, focused on their own meals and conversation. Then the food came, trays placed in front of each woman. White rice, steaming and fluffy, grilled fish, miso soup, clearly made by someone who knew Japanese cooking, pickled vegetables, and hot tea, green tea, served in simple cups. The women stared at the food as if it might be a mirage. Keiko picked up her chopsticks with trembling hands. She had not seen a full meal like this in 6 months. Rations on Saipan had dwindled to almost nothing as the Americans closed in. They had eaten weeds, roots, anything they could find. 3 women in their unit had died of starvation before the surrender. She took a bite of rice. The texture, the taste, the warmth. It flooded her senses. She closed her eyes and a tear rolled down her cheek. Around her, other women began to eat. Some ate slowly, savoring every bite. Others ate quickly, almost frantically, as if afraid the food would be taken away. A few could not eat at all, too overwhelmed, too confused by the contradiction of it. Yuki ate her miso soup in small sips, the warmth spreading through her chest. She thought of her mother's kitchen, of meals before the war, of normalcy that seemed a lifetime ago. The soup tasted almost like home. How could the enemy know how to make miso soup? How could the enemy care enough to try? One of the younger women, Michiko, suddenly dropped her chopsticks. She was 19, had been a typist in the medical corps. She covered her face with her hands and began to sob, not quiet crying. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. The sound echoed through the tent. Some of the American soldiers looked over, concerned. A female nurse approached and knelt beside Michiko, speaking softly even though Michiko could not understand English. The translator came over. "What is wrong? Are you hurt?" Michiko shook her head, unable to speak. Keiko answered for her in Japanese. "She's confused. We were told you would hurt us. Instead, you feed us." The translator relayed this to the nurse, who nodded slowly, her face showing something like sadness. She patted Michiko's shoulder and stood up, leaving the women to their meal. After eating, they were given more tea. Some of the women had eaten too much, their stomachs unused to full meals, and felt sick. But even the nausea felt like a blessing compared to the gnawing emptiness of starvation. As they sipped their tea, they looked at each other across the tables, seeing the same confusion reflected in every face. What was happening? Why were they being treated this way? Was it a trick to make them compliant before the real punishment began? Or was something else going on, something that did not fit anything they had been taught about the enemy? As darkness fell, they were taken to their barracks. It was a simple wooden structure, raised slightly off the ground, with screens on the windows to keep out insects. Inside, rows of cots lined the walls. Each cot had a thin mattress, a pillow, and a folded blanket. After months of sleeping on cave floors or concrete, the sight of actual beds made several women stop in the doorway. They filed in slowly, each choosing a cot. Yuki sat on hers and tested the mattress. It was thin, military issue, nothing luxurious. But it was a bed. She lay back, feeling the pillow under her head, and stared at the ceiling. The barracks smelled of wood and canvas, clean and dry. Outside, she could hear American voices, the sound of trucks, someone laughing. An American guard, a young corporal who looked barely 20, brought in a kerosene lamp and hung it from a hook in the center of the room. He said something in English that none of them understood, then paused at the door. He seemed to be trying to think of what to say. Finally, he just nodded and left, pulling the door closed behind him but not locking it. The women heard his footsteps moving away. Silence fell over the barracks. They lay in their cots, still dressed in the clothes they had been given, too afraid to relax completely. Keiko broke the silence, speaking in Japanese. "We should take turns staying awake, to keep watch." Several women murmured agreement. They organized shifts, 4 women awake at a time while the others attempted to sleep. But sleep would not come easily. Every sound outside made them tense. Footsteps approaching, then passing by. Voices calling to each other in English. A truck starting up. The tropical night was full of unfamiliar noises, and each one could be a threat. Yuki lay with her eyes open, watching the shadows move across the ceiling as the lamp flame flickered. Around midnight, they heard footsteps approaching the barracks. Multiple people. The women who were supposed to be sleeping sat up. Hearts began to pound. This was it. Whatever the Americans had been planning, it was happening now. In the darkness. When they were isolated and vulnerable, the footsteps stopped outside the door. Keiko stood up, her face set with determination. If they were coming for the women, they would have to go through her first. Other women quietly picked up anything that could serve as a weapon, a shoe, a belt. One woman had hidden a sharp piece of metal from the ruins. They waited, barely breathing as the door handle turned. The door opened. 3 Americans stood there, 2 soldiers and a female nurse. They carried bundles in their arms. The nurse spoke, and the translator's voice came from behind her. "The temperature drops at night. We brought extra blankets and tea." They walked in slowly, non-threateningly, and began placing wool blankets on the empty cots. One of the soldiers carried a large thermos and a stack of cups. The women stared, their makeshift weapons forgotten. Blankets. Hot tea. The nurse smiled at them, a genuine smile with no trace of mockery, and poured tea into cups, handing them out. "Sleep well," the translator said. Then they left, closing the door quietly behind them. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Michiko started laughing. It was a strange, almost hysterical laugh, but not unkind. "Blankets," she said in Japanese. "They brought us blankets." Other women began to laugh too, the sound mixed with crying, a release of tension so powerful it left them shaking. Yuki picked up one of the blankets and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was thick, warm, and smelled faintly of storage and mothballs. She held her cup of tea in both hands, feeling the heat seep into her palms. This was real. This was actually happening. The enemy had brought them blankets and tea. That night marked a turning point. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of something. The women slept more soundly than they had in months, wrapped in American blankets, in American beds, behind American guards who did not hurt them. It was confusing and frightening in its own way, but it was also undeniably real. Morning came with the sound of a bell. The women woke slowly, disoriented, having to remember where they were. Sunlight streamed through the screened windows. The door opened, and the same young corporal from the night before gestured for them to come out. They filed into the morning, blinking in the bright tropical sun. Breakfast was served in the same mess tent. Rice porridge, fish, pickles, and hot tea. A simple meal, but more food than they had seen in months. After breakfast, they were organized into work groups. Through the translator, they learned they would be assigned to help with laundry, cleaning, and food preparation. Light work, the translator emphasized. They would be paid in camp script that could be used at a small canteen. The work was indeed light, especially compared to the harsh conditions they had endured on Saipan. Yuki was assigned to help with laundry, washing sheets and towels in large tubs. The work was mundane, repetitive, and oddly comforting. It gave her something to focus on besides her confusion and fear. The American soldiers they worked alongside were mostly polite, sometimes awkward. Many were young, barely older than the Japanese women. They communicated through gestures and simple words. One soldier, a tall man from somewhere called Minnesota, tried to teach Yuki the English word for soap. He pointed at the soap, said, "Soap," several times, then grinned when she repeated it back to him. It was such a normal human interaction that it left Yuki feeling off balance for hours afterward. Days turned into a routine. Wake at dawn, breakfast, work detail, lunch, more work, dinner, evening in the barracks. The sameness of it was both reassuring and unsettling. Where was the cruelty they had expected? Where was the degradation? The Americans treated them like prisoners of war. Not honored guests, certainly, but not monsters either. Just prisoners to be housed and fed according to some set of rules the women did not fully understand. The camp had a small canteen where prisoners could buy items with their work script. The first time the women were allowed to visit, they approached it like explorers entering unknown territory. Inside, the shelves held items that seemed impossible. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, writing paper, pencils, even small toiletries like toothbrushes and combs. Keiko stood in front of the chocolate display, staring. Real chocolate. American chocolate wrapped in bright paper. The price was listed in script, affordable after a week of work. She picked up a bar, feeling its weight, its realness. In Japan, chocolate had become impossible to find years ago. Everything had been rationed, then rationed more, then disappeared entirely. And here, in a prisoner of war camp, she could buy chocolate. She bought the bar and saved it, placing it carefully in her small footlocker. That night, she broke off a single square and let it melt on her tongue. The sweetness was almost painful. She thought of her daughter in Tokyo, now 7 years old, who had never tasted chocolate. She thought of her husband if he was still alive, fighting somewhere in China or maybe already dead. She thought of her city, burned and starving. Letters began to arrive, not from home. Those connections had been severed, but between the women themselves and their captors. The Americans provided paper and pencils, and some of the younger women began to write down their thoughts, keeping diaries in Japanese that no one else could read. Yuki wrote every night by lamplight, her hand moving across the paper in characters that felt like home. She wrote about the contradictions, how the food was better than what she had eaten even before the war became desperate, how the Americans sometimes smiled at them, offered cigarettes, treated them with a casual friendliness that felt more insulting than hostility would have been. How dare they be kind? How dare they make this easy? But no letters came from Japan, no news of families, of cities, of the war's end and its aftermath. The women existed in a bubble of information, knowing only what the Americans told them through the translator. The war is over. Japan surrendered. Your country is occupied. The emperor spoke on the radio. These facts felt unreal, impossible. Japan had never been occupied. Japan had never surrendered. The emperor's voice had never been heard by common people. And yet here they were, fed and housed by the enemy, alive when they should be dead. The cognitive dissonance grew worse, not better, as the days passed. If the Americans had been cruel, it would have made sense. Cruelty fit the narrative they had been taught. But this strange bureaucratic kindness, this adherence to rules about prisoner treatment, this casual decency, it made no sense at all. Michiko voiced what many were thinking one evening as they sat in the barracks. Why are they doing this? What do they want from us? Keiko, older and more experienced, said quietly, maybe they do not want anything. Maybe this is just what they do. The idea was almost more frightening than malice. If the Americans treated prisoners well, not for gain, but simply because of rules, what did that say about everything they had been told? What did it say about their own nation's treatment of prisoners? Some women refused to accept it. They remained suspicious, waiting for the trap. They hoarded food, hid small items they could use as weapons, and spoke to the Americans as little as possible. But even their resistance was wearing thin. It is hard to maintain hatred against someone who brings you blankets at night. The breakthrough came in small moments. A guard named Roberts, who spoke a few words of Japanese learned from a phrase book, tried to make jokes. They were terrible jokes, lost in translation, but he smiled so genuinely when he mangled the pronunciation that some of the women could not help but smile back. Smiling at the enemy, it felt like betrayal. The female nurse, Captain Morrison, took particular interest in the women's welfare. She checked on them daily, asked about their health, and arranged for medicine when needed. One day, Keiko's knee injury flared up badly, making it hard for her to walk. Captain Morrison noticed immediately and had her sent to the camp medical facility. There, an American doctor examined her, took x-rays, and prescribed anti-inflammatory medication. The x-ray machine was new technology, frightening and miraculous. Keiko lay still as images were taken of her bones. The doctor showed her the pictures, pointing to where the joint was damaged. He prescribed rest, medication, and physical therapy. All of this, the examination, the x-rays, the treatment, was provided freely, as if she were a person who mattered rather than an enemy prisoner. Yuki had her own moment of connection. While hanging laundry one afternoon, she heard music. An American soldier sat on the steps of a nearby building, playing a harmonica. The tune was sad and sweet. Something about home. Yuki knew the feeling in the music even though she did not know the song. She stopped working and listened. The soldier noticed her and paused. Then he started playing again, watching her face. When he finished, he smiled and said something in English. Yuki did not understand the words, but she understood the meaning. Music transcends language. She bowed slightly, a habit from home, and he laughed. Not mockingly, but with pleasure. Then he played another song, this one more upbeat, and she found herself humming along, trying to match the melody. These small interactions accumulated. A shared cigarette, a guard helping to carry a heavy basket of laundry, an American soldier showing pictures of his family, his mother, his sisters, his dog, all the way back in a place called Iowa. The pictures were worn from being carried in his pocket. He looked at them with such obvious homesickness that Michiko, watching, felt a pang of recognition. He missed his home the same way she missed hers. The realization was uncomfortable. These Americans were not monsters. They were young men, far from home, doing a job they had been sent to do. Some of them were kind, some were indifferent, some were clearly uncomfortable around the Japanese women, their prejudices showing through. But none of them were the demons of propaganda. One evening, a group of American soldiers organized a movie night. A screen was set up in the camp yard and a projector showed American films. The Japanese women were invited to attend. Most went, curious despite themselves. The film was in English, which they did not understand, but it was a comedy, and physical humor translated. Women who had not laughed in months found themselves giggling at a man slipping on a banana peel, at a chase scene through a department store. Afterward, walking back to their barracks, the women were quiet. Something had shifted. They had spent an evening being entertained by their captors, laughing at American humor, sharing space with American soldiers without fear. It felt like crossing a line they had not meant to cross. Yuki lay awake in her cot, staring at the ceiling. 2 months had passed since their capture. 2 months of regular meals, clean water, work that did not break them, and Americans who treated them with a strange mixture of professionalism and casual kindness. Her body had responded to the change. She had gained weight. Her skin had cleared. Her hair, once dull and brittle, was shiny again. She looked healthier than she had in years. This physical restoration should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like a betrayal. She was a prisoner of war. She was supposed to be suffering. The emperor had asked his people to endure hardship, to sacrifice everything for Japan. And here she was, growing fat on American rice, sleeping in American beds, laughing at American movies. She thought about Tokyo, about her family. Were they eating? Did they have shelter? Her father would be devastated by the defeat. He had been so proud when she joined the military auxiliary, so certain Japan would prevail. What would he think if he could see her now, healthy and fed by the enemy? The contradiction gnawed at her constantly. She had been taught that Americans were barbaric, that they had no honor, no respect for others. But everything she experienced contradicted this. The Americans had rules. They followed protocols. They treated prisoners according to international agreements she had never heard of before capture. When someone was sick, they provided medical care. When someone was cold, they provided blankets. But if the propaganda about Americans was false, what else had been false? The question terrified her. She had built her entire understanding of the war, of her role, of her duty, on the foundation of that propaganda. If the foundation crumbled, what was left? She wrote in her diary, her characters flowing across the page. I do not know who I am anymore. I was a Japanese woman, loyal to the emperor, ready to die for my country. Now I am a prisoner who eats American food and sleeps in American blankets and feels grateful for both. Is this what defeat means? Not death, but the slow dissolution of everything you believed? Other women wrestled with similar conflicts. Michiko, the youngest, seemed almost to embrace the new reality. She learned English phrases quickly, smiled at the guards, and adapted with the flexibility of youth. But even she had moments of doubt, times when she would fall silent and stare into the distance, clearly thinking of home and family. Keiko carried the burden differently. As the oldest, she felt responsible for maintaining their dignity, their identity as Japanese women. She insisted they continue certain rituals, bowing to each other in the morning, speaking Japanese among themselves, maintaining the hierarchies of age and rank that had existed in their unit. These small acts of cultural preservation were her way of resisting the slow erosion of their identity, but even Keiko felt the pull of gratitude toward their captors. When Captain Morrison arranged for her knee to be properly treated, when the American doctor spent an hour carefully explaining her condition through a translator, when the physical therapist worked patiently with her to restore mobility, these acts of care chipped away at her certainty. One night she gathered the women for a meeting. They sat in a circle in the barracks, speaking in low voices, even though no Americans were present to overhear. We must remember who we are, Keiko said. We must not forget Japan. We must not forget our duty. But even as she spoke, her words felt hollow. Duty to what? A war that was over? An empire that had surrendered? A government that had sent them to die on a remote island and then forgotten about them? The debates in the barracks grew more intense as time passed. Not arguments exactly, but discussions that touched on increasingly uncomfortable questions. How should they feel about their captivity? What did they owe to Japan? What did survival mean in the context of total defeat? One evening, a woman named Akiko, who had been a nurse, said what many were thinking but few dared to voice. They treat us better than our own officers did. The statement hung in the air. It was true. Many of the women had experienced harsh treatment from Japanese officers during the war. Military discipline had been brutal, especially for women, who were seen as somehow less than real soldiers, even as they were expected to sacrifice everything. Michiko added, My commander hit me once for a small mistake in a report. With his fist. I had a bruise for 2 weeks. She touched her cheek at the memory. None of these Americans have hit any of us. Not once. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The enemy, the supposed barbarians, showed more restraint and humanity than their own military had. But not everyone accepted this conclusion. A woman named Sato, rigid and traditional, spoke up sharply. "You forget yourself. Japanese officers were preparing us for sacrifice, for the ultimate service to the emperor. American softness is not kindness, it is weakness. They treat us well because they have no honor, no understanding of duty." Her words carried the weight of the old ideology, the beliefs they had all shared once. Yet even Sato's conviction seemed to waver sometimes. When she fell ill with a fever, it was Captain Morrison who sat with her through the night, bringing cold compresses, monitoring her temperature, ensuring she received antibiotics. Sato recovered, and afterward she was quieter in her denunciations, her certainty visibly shaken. The women began to share stories of life before capture, of the war years, of the tightening grip of militarism on daily life. They spoke of rationing that went from inconvenient to devastating, of air raids that destroyed whole neighborhoods, of family members sent to war who never returned, of the constant propaganda telling them to sacrifice more, endure more, believe more. And they spoke of the lies. The government had said Japan was winning, even as defeat became obvious. Officials had said the Americans would torture prisoners, even though that had not happened. Leaders had called for civilians to fight to the death rather than surrender, promising a glorious end that was really just death. How many of those other pronouncements had also been lies? Yuki found herself thinking about the Emperor's radio address, which they had heard about but not heard themselves. The voice of God they had been taught, speaking directly to his people for the first time ever. And he had told them to surrender, to accept defeat, to endure the unendurable. If the Emperor himself could change course so completely, what did that mean for all the EEDEC sacrifices that had come before? These discussions were dangerous, touching on thoughts that could have gotten them killed just months before. But here, in this strange American prison, they were free to question. No thought police listened in. No military police would drag them away for disloyalty. The irony was painful. They were prisoners, and yet they had more freedom to think and speak than they had ever had as supposedly free citizens of Imperial Japan. The transformation happened gradually, then suddenly. There was no single moment of realization, but rather an accumulation of small truths that eventually became undeniable. The Americans were not monsters. Their own government had lied to them. The war had been lost, not because of insufficient sacrifice, but because it had been unwinnable from the start. And survival, mere survival, was not shameful. One afternoon, a group of American soldiers organized a baseball game and invited the Japanese women to watch. Baseball had been played in Japan before the war, though the government had tried to suppress it as too Western. Now, sitting on benches in the tropical sun, the women watched Americans play this familiar yet foreign game. Some of the soldiers tried to explain the rules, using gestures and the few Japanese words they had learned. When one team scored, half the watching women cheered along with the Americans before catching themselves. They had cheered for an American team, in an American game, while being held as American prisoners. The absurdity of it made Michiko laugh out loud, and once she started, others joined in. They laughed at themselves, at the situation, at the strangeness of the world they now inhabited. Keiko watched the younger women laughing and felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that they could still laugh, sadness at what their laughter represented, a letting go of the old certainties. And underneath it all, a growing acceptance that perhaps this letting go was necessary for survival. Not just physical survival, but the survival of their humanity, their ability to find joy even in captivity. The most profound moment came when Captain Morrison showed them a film. Not a Hollywood comedy this time, but news footage of Japan. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Tokyo. The cities were gone, reduced to ash and rubble. The footage showed survivors wandering through the ruins, children with burns, women searching for family members. The atomic bombs, the firebombing, the complete destruction. The women watched in silence, many crying openly. This was what their homeland looked like now. This was what the war had done. Yuki thought of her neighborhood in Tokyo and felt certain it was gone. All of it. Her home. Her school. The shops she had known since childhood. All turned to ash by American bombs. But the Americans sitting around them, watching the same footage, did not look triumphant. Some looked uncomfortable. Some looked sad. One young soldier got up and left, his face pale. They were not celebrating the destruction. They were showing it to the prisoners not as a boast, but as information, as context, as truth. After the film ended, Captain Morrison spoke through the translator. "The war is over. Japan is being rebuilt. Your families, if they survived, are receiving aid. American aid. Food, medicine, supplies. We are not your friends, but we are no longer your enemies. We are all just people trying to survive what happened." Words were simple, but they carried weight. That night, the women talked late into the evening. About home. About what they would find when they returned. About whether they could return, whether there was anything to return to. And underneath all of it, unspoken but understood, was a new realization. The war had destroyed Japan, but the peace was being built by the very people they had been taught to see as devils. American food was feeding Japanese children. American medicine was treating Japanese wounded. American engineers were helping to rebuild Japanese cities. The ideology they had been raised with, Japan as superior, Americans as barbarians, war as glorious, had been shattered as completely as the cities in that film. What would they build in its place? That was the question that kept them awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the American camp outside their barracks. The turning point came on a cold December evening, 3 months after their capture. A storm had moved in, bringing rain and unusual cold to the tropical island. The barracks, designed for heat, provided little protection against the chill. The women huddled under their blankets, shivering, trying to stay warm as rain hammered against the roof. Around 8 p.m., they heard vehicles pulling up outside. Then voices, American voices, speaking urgently. The women tensed. Why were Americans coming now? In the storm? In the dark? The old fears resurfaced immediately. This was the moment they had been waiting for all along. The kindness had been a trick, and now the truth would be revealed. The door burst open, and 3 soldiers entered, soaked from the rain. They carried large bundles. Behind them came Captain Morrison and 2 other nurses, also drenched. The translator rushed in last, shaking water from his jacket. "There is a problem with the heating system in this building," the translator said. "It cannot be fixed until morning. We are moving you to another barracks with working heat. Please gather your things quickly." The women scrambled to collect their few possessions. This seemed real, a practical response to a practical problem. But the old suspicion remained. Where were they really being taken? They were led through the rain to a larger barracks building closer to the main camp. Inside it was warm. A potbelly stove glowed in the corner, radiating heat. The bunks here were better, with thicker mattresses. On each bunk lay 2 blankets instead of 1, and at the foot of each bed was a small package wrapped in brown paper. Captain Morrison spoke, and the translator relayed her words. "We apologize for the inconvenience. The packages contain warm socks, an extra shirt, and some small personal items. We also brought hot soup and tea." As if on cue, 2 soldiers wheeled in a cart with a large pot of soup, stacks of bowls, and a container of hot tea. The women stood frozen, water dripping from their clothes onto the wooden floor. This was not a trick. This was genuine care in response to a genuine need. The Americans had noticed they were cold and had moved them to warmth. They had provided not just necessities, but comforts. Extra blankets, warm clothes, hot food on a cold night. Yuki felt something break inside her. Not break, exactly. More like a wall crumbling, a resistance giving way. She sat on the nearest bunk and opened her package. Inside were thick wool socks, a flannel shirt, a comb, a bar of soap, and a small chocolate bar. Such simple things, such thoughtful things. She picked up the chocolate and started to cry. Around her, other women were having similar reactions. Michiko clutched her new socks and wept. Akiko held the flannel shirt to her face, feeling its softness. Even Keiko, always controlled, sat with her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Sato, the most resistant, the one who had insisted longest that American kindness was weakness, stared at her package and whispered, "Why? Why do they do this?" Captain Morrison moved among them, her face showing concern. She did not need translation to understand what was happening. She had seen it before, this moment when prisoners stopped seeing their captors as the enemy and started seeing them as people. It was always emotional, always difficult, always necessary for healing to begin. The women ate their soup, drank their tea, and slowly warmed up. They changed into dry clothes and the new shirts they had been given. They put on the wool socks and felt their feet finally grow warm. And as they settled into their new bunks, under their extra blankets, in the warmth of the heated barracks, something fundamental shifted. Yuki wrote in her diary that night, her hand steadier than it had been in weeks. "Tonight I understood something. The Americans do not treat us well because they are weak. They treat us well because they believe it is right. They have rules about how to treat prisoners, and they follow those rules even when it would be easier not to, even when we are the enemy, even when we might not deserve it. This is not weakness. This is something else, something I do not have a word for in Japanese." The word she was looking for was humanity. Not the humanity that exists between friends or family, but the humanity that extends even to strangers, even to enemies. The recognition that even in war, certain things remain sacred. Dignity, basic care, the acknowledgement that suffering should be minimized even when it cannot be eliminated. That night, for the first time since their capture, none of the women kept watch. They all slept, truly slept, warm and fed and safe. And in the morning, when they woke, they would begin the final stage of their transformation, learning to live with the knowledge that everything they had been taught was wrong, and that perhaps, in that wrongness, there was also an opportunity for something new. As 1946 began, word spread through the camp that repatriation would begin soon. The Japanese prisoners would be sent home. This should have been joyous news. Instead, it filled many of the women with dread. Home no longer meant what it once had. Home was destroyed cities. Home was starvation and occupation. Home was facing people who had suffered while they had been fed. Yuki thought constantly about her family. If they had survived the bombing and the firebombing, what would they think of her when she returned? She had gained weight. Her face was full and healthy. Her hair was clean and shiny. She looked better than she had before the war. How could she face people who had nearly starved while she ate American rice? And there was more than guilt. There was fear of leaving the security they had found. Life in the camp was simple, predictable, safe. They knew what to expect. They knew they would be fed, housed, treated fairly. What awaited them in Japan? Chaos, starvation, judgment from neighbors who might see them as traitors for surviving in enemy hands. Some of the women confessed they did not want to leave. Michiko said it out loud one evening. "I am afraid to go home." The admission hung in the air, shameful and honest. Keiko nodded slowly. "I understand. But we must. Japan is our home no matter what we find there. We must return and help rebuild." Her words were brave, but her voice shook. She was afraid, too. The Americans began processing them for departure. Medical exams, documentation, lists and forms. Captain Morrison met with each woman individually, asking about their health, ensuring they were fit to travel, providing medicine for those who needed it. To Yuki, she said through the translator, "You will face difficulties at home, but you are strong. You survived the war. You survived us. You will survive what comes next." It was oddly comforting, this reassurance from her former captor. The day of departure arrived. The women gathered their few possessions, the clothes they had been given, small items they had bought at the canteen, their diaries and letters. Many of the guards came to see them off. Roberts, who had tried so hard to learn Japanese, gave them a clumsy bow and said sayonara with his terrible accent. Some of the women laughed, some cried. Michiko hugged him impulsively, breaking all protocol, and he awkwardly patted her shoulder. Captain Morrison presented each woman with a small package: soap, toothbrush, comb, and chocolate. "For the journey," she said. Practical items, but also a reminder of everything that had passed between them. Keiko accepted her package and bowed deeply, formally in the Japanese way. Captain Morrison bowed back, not quite right, but sincere. The ship that would take them home was waiting at the dock. As they boarded, Yuki turned to look back at the camp. It had been her prison. It had also been her sanctuary. The contradictions would never be fully resolved. She would carry them for the rest of her life. The voyage back to Japan took 2 weeks. The women had time to think, to prepare themselves for what they would find. They shared their fears and hopes in long conversations on deck. They made promises to stay in touch, though they knew the chaos of post-war Japan might make that impossible. They became not just fellow prisoners, but something deeper. Survivors who shared a truth no one else would understand. When land finally appeared on the horizon, Japan, home, everything they had dreamed of during their captivity, the women did not cheer. They stood at the rail in silence, looking at the scarred coastline, the destroyed ports, the evidence of total defeat. This was the Japan they would return to. Not the Japan they had left, not the Japan of their memories, but this broken, occupied, defeated nation trying to rise from its own ashes. Yuki returned to Tokyo and found her family alive, but living in poverty in a makeshift shelter. Her father looked at her with a mixture of relief and something she could not quite name. Shame? Confusion? She was alive and healthy while so many had died. How could he process that? She never spoke much about her captivity. When neighbors asked, she said only that she had been treated according to international law. She did not mention the blankets, the tea, the chocolate, the care. These memories were too complex to share with people who had suffered so differently. But she kept her diary. Decades later, when her own daughter was grown, Yuki finally showed it to her. Her daughter read the entries with tears streaming down her face. "You were treated kindly by the enemy?" she asked. Yuki nodded. "Sometimes the enemy is more human than your own side. That is one of the hardest lessons of war." Keiko lived to be 87. In her final years, she spoke more openly about her experiences. She told her grandchildren, "They treated us like we mattered. Not because they liked us, not because we deserved it, but because they believed certain rules should not be broken, even in war. That belief saved my life and my soul. It taught me that civilization is not about who wins. It is about what you refuse to do, even when you have the power to do it." And so the blankets and tea became more than simple comforts on a cold night. They became symbols of something larger. The idea that even in the midst of the most terrible war in human history, humanity could persist. That rules mattered. That dignity mattered. That how you treat people, even enemy people, defines who you are more than whether you win or lose. For those 47 Japanese women, the night the Americans brought blankets instead of violence became the central memory of the war. Not the battles, not the defeat, not even the atomic bombs, but that moment when their expectations of horror met the reality of basic human decency. when the enemy they had been taught to fear showed them that the real divide in the world is not between nations, but between those who hold on to their humanity even in war and those who let it slip away. As Yuki wrote in the final entry of her diary, years after the war, "We prepared for death and received life. We prepared for cruelty and received care. We prepared to face monsters and met human beings. The blankets were warm, but the lesson was harder and colder. We had been lied to about everything. And yet from those lies we learned the most important truth, that enemies can show mercy, and mercy is the greatest victory of all. That is the story worth remembering. If you found this account meaningful, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories of World War II, the ones that show complicated truths about humanity in its darkest moments, deserve to be preserved and shared. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story from history."